If you've been reading my blog for a while or listening to this podcast since July, I think you know that I'm not going to talk about Drake London's day-to-day status or George Kittle's hamstring injury or wow, Emeka Egbuka really took off. Let's devote a whole episode to what we all saw or what we all understand. Instead, I want to always talk about something that maybe a lot of people aren't talking about or haven't fully grasped the implications of. Maybe I don't know the implications yet, but it's still interesting and it means something. Hopefully in the coming weeks, months, we figure out what that something is. In this case, almost all of the running backs who had at least 10 carries through last night's game uh, finished with less than 4 yards a carry. I think it was like 12 of the top 14 running backs in terms of number of carries in week one so far, average less than 4 yards a carry. It's a pretty insane stat because the guys who are getting all those carries are generally either established running backs or high-priced rookies or complementary running backs who play a meaningful enough role where they're there for a reason. They're the 1B or they're the number two, and they're good enough to be near or at the top of the depth chart. That much inefficiency is concerning because if you've got, you take Derrick Henry on one extreme, or even the lesser extreme of Nick Chubb in his prime, or Barry Sanders, when you get guys who are averaging 5+ yards a carry, the impact that has on fantasy should be pretty evident. They're more likely to keep drives going and help manufacture or contribute to first downs, which means that those extended drives lead to often more carries or more touches in general, which means more fantasy points. Running backs who average 3 yards a carry are not really helping their team move the chains to the same extent. And I think if you looked at the numbers, I haven't looked at them because it would take months to get all this together. But common sense would suggest that a running back on a team that's getting 3 yards a carry, unless the quarterback and the receiving core is incredible, that's going to stymie some of their drives. That's just natural, whereas the 5 yards a carry is going to help sustain drives and promote those fantasy points. The fact that so many running backs average less than 4 yards a carry is concerning if you drafted many of those running backs or some of those running backs, that there's guys out there who might lose their starting job in the next 2 to 3 weeks, if not sooner, because their backup ran better on fewer touches. Trey Benson is a good example versus James Conner. If you listen to this podcast, and I'm not the only one who talked about it, but Conner was obviously overvalued. I talked a great deal about him here and on the blog, talked a great deal about why Trey Benson was one of the best handcuff bargains that you could get. Same thing with Zach Charbonnet. I ranked him, I think he was my RB 25 or something like that versus an RB 35 average draft position. He might overtake Kenneth Walker at some point, maybe sometime soon. He simply ran better. Yards per carry is not the end-all be-all, obviously. There are running backs who, and I mentioned Eddie George early on in the podcast during his heyday in, I guess, the 90s, early 2000s, maybe more early to mid 2000s, that he averaged about 3.5 or so yards a carry, but he was a workhorse, and the team was pretty good during much of his tenure, and it worked. It worked for that team. But then you get the Todd Gurleys of the world who they fall into 3.4 yards per carry, or Le'Veon Bell, getting like 3.2 yards a carry. That's generally a sign that their career's over. Unless there's a dramatic turnaround, if you're a little bit older and you're not able to put together 4 yards a carry, it's kind of this goal that running backs. I'm sure running backs don't have that goal, but if you're a fantasy manager, you want to see your running backs average about 4 yards a carry. If they're averaging 3.5 and they're not, the established bell cow, unquestioned bell cow, there is a risk that the team might look for somebody else to fill in, help out and see what they can do. And then before you know it, your starting running back, who's averaged 3.5 yards per carry, has been replaced by a backup averaging 4.2. That's why yards per carry matters. It's twofold. It's the sustaining drives and promoting fantasy points, the ceiling that players have, and also keeping that player relevant on that team. The fact that roughly 12 of the 14 most carries, among running backs this week, average less than 4 yards per carry is pretty astounding. Um, we're going to know a lot more in week two. I want to track this stat and see where it goes. Because in week two, if something similar happens, is it a sign that running backs are even less trustworthy than they have been in recent years? I mean, there was a time when in the 90s, for example, you could draft running back, and maybe even a third running back in the third round if you wanted running back in your flex spot. And if all three of those running backs were getting 200 plus touches because they were all the bell cows for their respective teams, you were pretty good shape at that point. You don't do that anymore. It's not that easy. You can't just reach for a running back who's a quote unquote bell cow and expect them to be a bell cow unless they're among the elites. And even some of the elites this past week did not get 4 yards per carry, weren't even close. I could talk a great deal about Christian McCaffrey and the poor running that he did. He was fantastic through the air, but he had 31 touches. And for a guy who, at his age, with 400 touch seasons twice in his career, to get 31 touches, dealing with a calf injury, at going on 29 to 30 years old, that is, it starts to become kind of well, what's going on here? So his 3.1 yards per carry actually matters a lot more than people might let on because, wow, I got 31 touches and, he was great through the air. Yeah, but if he's not running well, it doesn't mean he's going to be benched. It just means that if he's not running well, something might be wrong. And that becomes the concern. There's a lot of these running backs where if they're getting 2 yards a carry, I think Kenneth Walker had like 2 yards a carry, and he was dealing with, I think it was a foot issue during the preseason. So it may be related to that. But when a running back is running that poorly, something could be wrong. Maybe it's a fluke. We'll know more in week two, but I would encourage you to track that, and I'll track it as well heading into week two. Are we going to see more of these starters struggle to get traction? And if so, what does that tell us about them? And what does it tell us about the position as a whole? That if running backs in general are averaging less yards per carry, then it means the running back position as a whole is sustaining fewer drives and as a result, scoring fewer fantasy points on balance and then becoming less valuable compared to quarterbacks and wide receivers. Again, it's just 1 week, but that's why the week matters because it sets the stage for, is this a trend or is this a fluke? And in week two, we'll know a little more if it's a trend. I'm BJ Riddell, Fantasy Football for Winners. Follow me on the blog, email me at the Gmail account. See you tomorrow.